She is standing in the middle of the most magnificent room in London, and every person in it wants her to disappear. 200 candles, crystal pendants, catching and scattering the light into 1,000 small fires along the ceiling. Music. Or there was music a moment ago, before the musicians registered what was happening and simply stopped. Now there is only the sound of breathing, a room full of the finest names in England, and every single one of them is holding its breath. She has no gloves, no fan. The hem of her dress is gray with mud from the street. You can see where it was wet, and has dried into stiff pale lines along the fabric. Her hair has half fallen from its pins, one loose dark coil resting against her collarbone, as though even her hair has given up on appearances. Tonight, the bodice of her dress is mended at the shoulder in thread that does not match. Cream against ivory, barely visible unless you are close, and half the people in this room are close. They have pressed inward without realizing, the crowd drawing tighter the way crowds do when they sense something is about to happen. She is not trembling. That is the thing the audience notices first. And it is the right thing to notice, because she should be trembling. She has been dragged here, publicly, deliberately, against her will, by the man who destroyed her family. She has been brought into the most exclusive ballroom in London, wearing poverty like a costume, wearing it as proof of what she is. The man who brought her here intended this as a final act, a spectacle, a demonstration of what happens to women who do not know when to stop. She is not trembling. She is looking at something across the room, across the sea of staring faces, across the gleaming floor, past the men who have not yet decided whether to step forward or step away. She is looking at something, and whatever it is the thing that is keeping her still. You do not know yet what she is looking at. You do not know yet why she was brought here, or who brought her, or what she has been carrying in the bodice of that worn dress against her heart for 3 days, waiting for exactly the right room to be heard in. You do not know the name of the man who has just set down his glass, very slowly, very deliberately, the way a man sets down a glass when he has made a decision, and is now walking toward her through the parting crowd. You do not know yet, but you are about to. Let me take you back to where this began. Before I do, if you have found your way to this story, I want you to stay. Whispered Thrones is a home for stories about women who were written off and proved everyone wrong. If that is the kind of story that steadies you when the world does not, subscribe. It costs you nothing, and you will never miss what comes next. Now, let me take you back. Eleanor Vane, Nora to anyone who had ever loved her, which was now a very short list, was 23 years old and had been making herself small for 2 years. Not small in the way of shyness, not small in the way of insecurity, small in the specific, deliberate, tactical way of a woman who understands that visibility is dangerous and has chosen, for the time being, to trade it for survival. She had learned this the way she learned most things, from necessity and quickly, and without anyone to teach her. Her father had been a solicitor in Belwick, Derbyshire, Thomas Vane. 31 years in practice, 31 years of honest work, of careful record-keeping, of charging fair fees to the farmers and tradesmen who could not afford London lawyers, and trusted him with their modest but serious affairs. He was the kind of man who remembered the names of his clients' children. He was the kind of man who wrote down why he had made a decision, not just what the decision was, so that if anyone ever questioned it after his death, there would be a record. He did not foresee Aldous Croft. No one in Belwick had, quite. Croft had arrived in the county with recommendations from good families and the confident ease of a man who has never needed to earn anything, because he has always found ways to take it instead. He set himself up as a creditor, then as a magistrate. The two positions together gave him an extraordinary amount of quiet power in a rural county, the power to lend and the power to adjudicate the consequences of debt. He understood, with the instincts of a man who has studied these mechanisms carefully, exactly how much could be extracted from a community before it noticed. When Thomas Vane died, suddenly, of a fever, in the autumn of 1814, Croft moved within the month. He filed a claim against the practice. He alleged that funds held in trust by Thomas Vane had gone missing. He produced a deed with a witness signature attesting to a bequest. He produced a solicitor who confirmed the paperwork. He produced, in short, the appearance of evidence, and in the absence of Thomas Vane to contradict it, the appearance held. Nora had stood in the house she grew up in and told the men from the county office that it was false. She was 21 years old. She had no legal standing. She had grief and certainty and a box of her father's papers, most of which had been removed before she could stop them. They thanked her for her time and told her that grief was a powerful distorting force and that she ought to take care of herself. She had not cried in front of them. She had not cried at all. Not that day. Not for a long time after. There was too much to do, and crying did not do any of it. Within 3 months, she had sold what remained of the household contents, secured a letter of character from the local vicar, who believed her for all the good it did him, and written to 17 different households in London inquiring after a position as a companion or governess. One had replied, "A widow named Mrs. Dorothea Pelham, of moderate means and mild character, and a genuine inability to manage her own correspondence without assistance, had offered her 3 shillings a week and a room in her townhouse in one of the less fashionable streets of Marylebone. Nora had taken it. The room was the size of a wardrobe. The mattress dipped on one side. The window looked out onto a brick wall. Nora had stood in it on her first night in London and thought, 'This will do. It will do because it has a writing desk.' Every morning, before Mrs. Pelham woke, before the household stirred, before the coal boy came with his bucket and his racket on the basement stairs, Nora sat at that small desk and worked. She had a ledger handmade, her own hand, every page in which she had been reconstructing her father's accounts from memory, and from every fragment she had managed to preserve. Letters, receipts, a partial court record she had copied by hand in the county office the week before she left, fragments of correspondence she had found, folded into the lining of her father's old coat before it was taken. She had been building this ledger for 2 years. It was almost complete. She did not know yet that it contained the proof she needed. She only knew that it felt like the only honest thing in the world. Those early morning hours at the desk, the only place where the truth was being assembled from its scattered pieces. She worked through it with the same methodical patience her father had taught her, checking each column, noting each discrepancy, building toward something she could feel but not yet see. She pressed Mrs. Pelham's gowns. She attended events as an attendant, sitting by doors and walls, invisible. She wrote the letters Mrs. Pelham dictated, and the letters Mrs. Pelham intended to dictate, but couldn't quite finish. She said yes, and thank you, and of course, and slipped from rooms before the dancing began, because a paid companion had no standing in a ballroom, and both she and the room knew it. She kept herself small and careful, and she waited. She had heard Edmund Ashburn's name in connection with a parliamentary fraud committee that had been quietly assembling for the better part of a crab year. She knew his name the way she knew a dozen names, as a fact stored in the ledger of her mind next to other facts, cross-referenced, filed. The Duke of Kervale, fraud investigation, Derbyshire connections. She had not yet thought of him as a person. Edmund Ashburn, the actual person, was 31 years old and had the particular quality of self-containment that develops in men who have made one catastrophic moral mistake early in life and have spent every year since managing its consequences. He did not perform himself in public. He did not need to. He had 6 estates, a London townhouse, a majority interest in a Derbyshire mining concern. and the kind of old name that meant he could sit in silence at a parliamentary committee hearing while the men around him argued, and the room would still wait for his opinion. He had given his opinion at the last committee hearing with complete flatness. If you shelve this investigation, I will fund a private prosecution. Make your choice. He had then returned to the document he was reading. The room had gone quiet. It generally did. What the room did not know, and what Edmund had been carrying for 8 years, was this. He had funded Aldous Croft. Not the fraud. He had not known about the fraud. Not then. He was 23, newly inherited, still learning how to occupy the scale of his own power. Croft had come recommended by Edmund's late father, a man in Derbyshire, apparently trustworthy, looking to establish himself. Edmund had provided the initial capital that gave Croft his footing as a creditor. He had done it because Croft reminded him of the kind of man his father had trusted. And he had not yet learned that trust is not inheritable. He had learned, over subsequent years, that Croft was not merely an unscrupulous businessman, but a systematic fraudster who had used Edmund's money to build a mechanism for extracting wealth from people who had no recourse. And he had begun, quietly and carefully, building a case. He was 3 weeks from having it complete. He had been 3 weeks from complete, for somewhat longer than he was comfortable admitting. Among the documents that had come to him through the parliamentary investigation was a deed from Thomas Vane's practice, and with it a letter Thomas Vane had written in the last weeks of his life, addressed to whatever parliamentary body might eventually look into what was happening in Belwick. In it, Thomas Vane described the fraud with precision, named Croft by name, and described the forged deed that was at its center. And at the end, in the careful handwriting of a man who knew he was ill, and did not know how ill, he had written this: "My Eleanor has a mind for the law and a heart that has never once looked for the easy path. Whatever happens to me, find her, she already knows." Edmund had read this letter 3 times. He had not known what Eleanor Vane looked like. He had not known she was in London. He had not yet found a way to reach her. He told himself this was because finding her prematurely would risk alerting Croft before the case was complete. This was true. It was not the whole truth. The whole truth included the part where Edmund had read the letter 3 times and sat very still afterward and thought about what it meant for a man to have sat on this information for 4 months, while someone's daughter rebuilt her father's accounts by candlelight in a rented room. He preferred not to think about that part for longer than necessary. The first time he saw her, he did not know who she was. It was a small evening gathering at the home of Lord and Lady Fenwick, one of those mid-season entertainments too intimate for a ball and too crowded for real conversation. The kind of event Edmund attended because Fenwick sat on his fraud committee, and the committee required managing. The house smelled of hyacinths and beeswax. The candles had been lit an hour before the guests arrived, and the wax had already begun to run, leaving pale tracks down the silver holders that nobody had noticed yet. Edmund stood near the fireplace with a glass he was not drinking, and watched Fenwick hold court with 3 other men who were all talking at the same time. He noticed her because she stopped moving. The room was full of motion, fans and greetings, and the particular choreography of people who are performing ease they do not entirely feel. Into this motion, from the direction of the door, a single figure went completely still. Not frozen in the way of surprise. Still in the way of a person who has made an extremely rapid assessment of danger and is deciding what to do next. He followed the line of her attention and found its object. Aldous Croft, working the room with his usual ease, shaking hands, smiling, the picture of a welcome guest. Croft had come to London for the week. Edmund knew this. He had been watching Croft's movements. Edmund looked back at the woman by the door. She was young, perhaps 23, 24. A paid companion, by the look of her position in the room. by the way she had placed herself near the wall, near the exit, as close to invisible as a person could be, while still technically present. She was watching Croft with the expression of someone who had trained a long time not to show what she was feeling, and who was showing it anyway, in the very quality of her control. He asked Fenwick, quietly, who she was. Fenwick glanced over and shrugged vaguely. Companion to someone, he said. Pelham's woman, perhaps. Edmund looked back. She had not moved. Across the room, Nora was making herself be still, which was the only thing she had available to do, because Aldous Croft had just walked through the door, and she had not expected him, and the shock of it had done something to her chest that she needed to manage very quickly before it showed in her face. She breathed. She pressed her hands together in her lap. She breathed again. She had noticed the Duke of Ashford before Croft entered, because she noticed everything about every room she was in. It was survival training, not curiosity, and Edmund Ashford was the kind of man a room reorganized itself around without meaning to. He was not the tallest person present or the most demonstrative, but he was paying attention in a way that most people in that room were not, and attention, Nora had learned, was the most dangerous thing a person could bring into a social situation. Attention meant they were building a picture. She did not want to be in his picture. And then she made the mistake of looking at his face when he looked at Croft. It was the same look. Not the same emotion, perhaps. She could not know what he felt, but the same quality of seeing. The same specific, evidence-gathering, unsentimental attention she used when she looked at Croft. And it was so unexpected to see it in another face that something in her chest did what she could not afford it to do. It eased. Just slightly. Just for a moment. She looked away before he could register that she had been watching him. She did not have long to collect herself. Croft crossed the room toward her, wearing the smooth social smile that she had come to understand as his most dangerous expression. He stopped before her and bent his head slightly, as though exchanging pleasantries, and said very quietly, in a voice no one else could hear, "Still here, Miss Vane? I had hoped London would have finished with you by now." Nora did not flinch. She did not look away. She said equally quietly, "It hasn't." Croft smiled again, broader, this time the smile of a man who has just confirmed something useful, and moved away. He was back in the main flow of the room within seconds, laughing at something Fenwick said. From across the room, Edmund could not hear what had been exchanged. He watched the woman by the door turn back to the wall and fold her hands in her lap with the precise, deliberate care of someone rearranging something inside themselves that had been disturbed. He watched her breathe. He watched the quality of her stillness change from vigilance to something harder. Something in the scene lodged in him like a splinter. He was not a man who used the word intuition about himself. He preferred the word evidence. But sometimes evidence was not yet legible, and you simply knew that something was connected to something else, and you needed to find out how. He made a note of the name Pelham. He intended to act on it. He did not act on it quickly enough. 3 weeks after the Fenwick gathering, Nora found out about the civil claim, £80. The notice arrived by post on a Tuesday morning, addressed to Miss Eleanor Vane, and Nora read it standing in the hallway, with her coat still on from an errand for Mrs. Pelham. A formal civil notice. Croft, claiming that among the misappropriated funds in Thomas Vane's practice was a specific bequest owed to Croft personally, that as Thomas Vane's daughter and legal heir, the debt transferred to her, that she had 30 days to settle it. She had 30 days. She did not have £8. She read the notice twice. She folded it carefully. She went upstairs, sat at her desk, and opened the ledger. She had been afraid all this time of the specific fear that her grief had made her certain of something that was not true, that she believed in her father's innocence because she needed to, because the alternative, That he had been the kind of man she spent her life trusting, and he had not been that man at all, was a thing she could not survive believing. She had known this fear lived inside her certainty. She had carried them together, the certainty and the fear of the certainty, for 2 years, in desperation, because the timeline had collapsed and she was done waiting. She wrote a letter to the fraud committee. She wrote it carefully, formally, through the proper channels. She requested any information available regarding prior civil claims brought by Aldous Croft. She sent it. She waited. She received a brief, bureaucratic reply declining to share materials from an active investigation. The letter was signed by the committee secretary. The decision to decline, as she did not yet know, had been Edmund's. He had made it because releasing the documents prematurely would show Croft's lawyers exactly what evidence existed. It was correct as strategy. He did not know about the civil notice. He did not know she had 30 days. He was moving on a timeline that did not account for the fact that she did not have 3 weeks. 2 weeks later, very late at night, by the light of a candle she had already burned halfway down and could not afford to replace before morning, Nora found it. She had been staring at a partial copy of a deed. The same deed she had been staring at, on and off, for 2 years. The specific document she had never been able to make sense of. She had obtained a full copy 2 weeks before from the court registry, presenting herself as a solicitor's clerk, because she had no other mechanism for accessing it. The full copy had been sitting in her ledger, waiting for her to look at it with fresh attention. She looked at it now. There were 2 witness signatures on the deed. A deed of that kind required one. The second signature, she stared at it. She turned to 3 letters she had received from Croft's solicitor. She set them side by side. She moved the candle closer. Her hand was not entirely steady, but her eyes were. The handwriting matched. Croft's own solicitor had forged the document that destroyed her father. The same hand, the same pen pressure, the same particular way of forming the letter E with a loop that sat too high. A habit she had seen 3 times now. And here it was a 4th time, on a deed that should not have had a second witness, on a signature that had no right to exist. The relief was physical. She put her hand over her mouth and cried, not from grief, not from despair, not from the accumulated exhaustion of 2 years of careful, patient, invisible work. From vindication. She had been right. She had been right all along. The fear that lived inside the certainty went quiet, and all that was left was the certainty. And it was solid. It was real. It was documented. She cried for a few minutes. Then she wiped her face. Then she folded the deed and the letters together and slid them inside the bodice of her dress, because she had no safe place to keep them, and she intended to keep them on her person until someone with the power to act on them took them from her hands. She needed to find that person. She needed to find them fast. She wrote to Lord Fenwick. It was the name she had. A man who had been kind to Mrs. Pelham, who was on the committee, who might give her 10 minutes. She wrote a careful, precise letter explaining who she was and what she had, and asking for an audience. Fenwick, to his credit, wrote back within 48 hours to say he would see her the following week. Croft, who had a contact in Fenwick's household, knew about the letter within 2 days. The escalation was swift and methodical, the way Croft did everything. He called on Mrs. Pelham, charming, regretful, concerned, and mentioned that her companion had been making vexatious legal claims and involving herself in a parliamentary investigation, that the poor girl was clearly disordered by grief, that any respectable household risked entanglement. Mrs. Pelham was a kind woman. She was also, at heart, terrified of scandal. She told Nora that evening, with visible discomfort, that she had a fortnight to find other arrangements. Nora thanked her. She went upstairs. She sat at the desk. She did not open the ledger. She had 14 days. She had a forged deed and 3 letters. She had no housing in 14 days, and a civil writ coming in 10. And Lord Fenwick, she learned the next morning from a brief note, had been asked to delay her appointment. Just another 2 weeks. The note did not explain why. The decision, she did not know this yet, had been Edmund's. He was 3 weeks from having enough evidence for a prosecution. Croft could not survive. He believed he was protecting the case. He had not asked her if she had 2 weeks to give him. She did not have 2 weeks to give him. The Duke of Ashburn's annual spring ball fell 4 days before the writ was due to be issued. Mrs. Pelham had been invited. Nora was to come as her attendant. She had been to Ashburn House once before in this capacity. It was one of the grandest addresses in Mayfair, the kind of building that reminded you, just by existing, of the precise coordinates of your own smallness. They arrived at the door. The footman checked his list. Miss Vane was not on it. Nora stood on the step while Mrs. Pelham was admitted. She watched her employer hesitate, visibly distressed, and then make the choice that Nora had always known she would make if it came to it. She entered without her. The door closed. Nora stood on the street. She was calculating, rapidly and coldly, what she had left. The writ in 4 days, no housing in 10. Fenwick's appointment delayed. The committee unreachable. Croft everywhere, untouchable, smiling. She heard him behind her before she saw him. Croft had been watching from just inside the entrance. He came down the steps with the satisfied ease of a man who has arranged a situation to his precise specifications. He looked at her on the pavement and said, "You have no list, no case, no house in a fortnight, and no one in that room who knows your name. Go home, Miss Vane." And then, because he could not stop, because men like Croft always cannot stop, because the thing they want is not just the victory, but the visibility of the victory, he took her by the arm. He walked her back through the entrance, into the ballroom, into the blaze of 200 candles and 200 faces. She was in there before she had fully decided what to do about it. The room went quiet. The musicians stopped. She heard it, that specific silence, the silence of collective attention. And she thought, "This is every room I have been trying not to be seen in for 2 years, and I am in the center of it, in a mended dress, with no gloves, with mud on my hem." She thought, "I have nothing left to lose." And she thought, "I have been waiting for a room with enough people in it." She looked across the floor, past the staring faces, to where a man had set down his glass very slowly and deliberately, and was beginning to walk toward her. Edmund had been occupied all evening with the obligations of a host, receiving guests, managing the flow of a large house, performing the minimum social functions his rank required before he could retreat to the edges of his own party. He was not watching the door when Croft brought Nora through it. He heard the silence first, that particular quality of a room going still, not the quiet of a conversation ending, but the breath-held silence that means something unexpected has entered. He turned. He saw her. He had not, in the month since the Fenwick gathering, managed to put the woman by the door entirely out of his mind. The quality of that stillness, the way she had folded her hands and breathed after Croft walked away. He had made a note of Pelham. He had not acted on it quickly enough. He was aware of this. But it was not the recognition from Fenwick's party that stopped him now. It was something else entirely, because he knew her, not her face, her name. He knew her name from a letter he had read 3 times, and the letter had described her in a way that now, looking at a young woman standing in the center of his ballroom in a worn dress with a lifted chin, seemed to him less like description and more like instruction. Her father had written, "She already knows." The room was watching him. He was aware of that too. Every eye that had swiveled from Nora now swiveling to him, the host, to see what he would do. Croft was to her left, still wearing that smile. Somewhere at the edge of the crowd he could see Fenwick. Edmund began to walk. Nora saw him coming. She did not know, yet, what he was. She knew his name, his title, his committee. She did not know about the letter. She did not know that the madman, walking toward her through the parting crowd, had been carrying her father's last words for 4 months and had not found a way to reach her. She only knew that she had been brought here to be erased, and that the only available response to erasure was to refuse it. She spoke before he reached her, not to him, to the room. "My name is Eleanor Vane. My father was Thomas Vane of Belwick, Derbyshire. He was a solicitor for 31 years. He died 2 years ago with a false claim against his name. A claim constructed by a man in this room, with a forged document and a bought witness, so that man could absorb the practice and collect what was never owed him." The silence had the quality of held breath. She could hear the candles. She could hear, or imagine she could hear, the wax moving. "I have the proof. I have had the proof for 3 days. And I have been unable to give it to anyone, because the committee that could use it has been asked to wait. And I do not have time to wait, because in 10 days a writ will be issued against me for a debt my father did not owe, and I will have no home and no work and no recourse. So I am saying it here, in this room, because this is the only room I have left." She reached into the bodice of her dress. The room watched her hand moving. She produced a folded document, the forged deed, the letters, the thing she had been carrying against her heart for 3 days, and she held it out, not to Edmund, not to anyone specific, to the room itself, to the general direction of anyone with authority and the willingness to use it. Aldous Croft forged this, his own solicitor's hand. The signature is on 4 other documents I can produce. Someone in this room has the authority to take it. I am asking them to do so." She waited. Her arms were not shaking. She would not let them shake. She had spent 2 years learning how to hold still, and she was holding still now, in the most visible place she had ever stood, in front of more people than had ever looked at her at once, and she waited. Edmund reached her. He stopped 3 feet away. He looked at her, not at the document, at her, with an expression that several people in that room would try to describe to others afterward and find they could not quite manage. It was the expression of a man who has just understood something he had been not understanding for some time. A man who has been told a thing about himself and is in the process of acknowledging that it is true. He did not take the document from her hand. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he turned to a footman's nearby tray, took a glass, and drank. He set the glass down. He turned back, and then Edmund Ashburn, Duke of Kervale, in front of every lord and lady and person of consequence in that ballroom, went down on one knee. The room made no sound. He was not performing. There was nothing theatrical in the gesture. No sweep, no drama, no announcement. He simply went down on one knee on the polished floor of his own ballroom and looked up at a woman in a mended dress and said, very quietly, in a voice only she could hear, "I have something that belongs to you. I am sorry it took me this long to deliver it." Nora looked down at him. She did not speak. Something behind her eyes moved. Not tears, nothing so simple as tears. The specific expression of a person who has been bracing for a blow for so long that being met with the opposite is almost harder to absorb. Croft's smile had changed. It was still in place, but it had lost its certainty. The way a structure loses certainty when one of its load-bearing walls shifts. Edmund stood. He turned to the room and spoke clearly, the way he spoke at committee hearings, without drama, without performance, as though he were reading from a document he had already decided was definitive. He was the primary backer of the fraud committee, he told them. He had been in possession of evidence exonerating Thomas Vane for 4 months. His failure to act on that evidence sooner had consequences that the committee would need to formally account for. He said all of this without minimizing it. Several men at the edges of the room found reasons to look elsewhere. Because they were on the committee, and this was now a matter of public record, Croft opened his mouth. Edmund turned to him, unhurried, complete, and said, "Lord Fenwick, You are a magistrate. The document Miss Vane is holding is a forgery that can be verified within the hour. I would be grateful if you would take it." Fenwick crossed the room. Fenwick took the document. Croft watched it leave Nora's hand, and something passed through his face that was not quite an expression. Too fast, too controlled. And then he was smiling again. But the smile was working much harder than it had been 5 minutes ago. Nora stood very still in the center of the ballroom. She had not moved since she stopped speaking. The musicians had not resumed. The candles continued their work. Somewhere across the room, a woman she did not know was making her way toward her through the crowd. In 31 years of London seasons, no one in that room had seen a duke kneel. No one had seen a woman in a mended dress make an entire ballroom hold its breath. And no one, least of all Nora Vane, had expected that the truth, when it finally arrived, would arrive like this. The morning after the ball, Edmund arrived at Mrs. Pelham's house before 9 o'clock. He brought 2 things. The first was the letter, Thomas Vane's letter, the one written in the last weeks of his life, addressed to the Parliamentary Commission, with its careful description of the fraud and its precise handwriting and its final lines about his daughter. Edmund placed it on the writing desk in Nora's small room without commentary. He did not explain it. He did not ask her to read it while he watched. He simply put it in front of her and stepped back. She read it alone after he had gone. She did not tell anyone what it contained. But the next morning, when she sat down at the small desk before the household woke, the ledger was open, and beside it was a clean sheet of paper, and she was writing with the particular quality of attention that looks, from the outside, like perfect calm, and is from the inside something closer to peace. The second thing Edmund brought was a written directive to Croft's solicitor on Ashburn cress paper, informing him that the civil writ against Miss Eleanor Vane was being contested under the Fraud Committee's authority, and that any attempt to execute it would be treated as obstruction of a parliamentary proceeding. He had brought his own legal counsel, who waited in the carriage outside. This was not a romantic gesture. It was a practical act of repair, and its practicality was exactly what made it significant. Croft's solicitor was arrested within 6 weeks on the strength of the forged deed and a second document Edmund's investigation produced. A cancelled bank draft proving the supposed bequest had never existed. Croft faced a parliamentary censure hearing. He did not recover from it. The men who had backed him quietly retreated. The civil writ against Nora was vacated. A written statement from the Parliamentary Committee formally cleared Thomas Vane's name. Nora requested that the statement be printed in the same Derbyshire newspaper that had originally reported her father's disgrace. It was. She held the page in her hands and did not need to read it more than once. She received, at Edmund's specific written request, a recommendation from the Parliamentary Fraud Committee to a solicitor of good standing in London. Recommended by name as a legal clerk, the first woman ever so recommended by such a body. She took the position. She moved from Mrs. Pelham's house into a small set of rooms of her own. Mrs. Pelham told everyone she had always believed in Nora, and Nora let her. Edmund resigned from the committee chairmanship, not because he was removed. He was not, but because he chose to. He told his colleagues that a man who held exculpatory evidence for 4 months, while the affected party suffered, had no business chairing a fraud investigation. He remained on the committee in a reduced capacity. He was less comfortable than he had been. He was more honest. 3 months after the ball at Ashburn House, in a solicitor's office in Holborn, where the morning light came through the window at an angle that caught the dust in the air and made it look like something deliberate, Nora was working. She was working through a deed of conveyance, not her own, but a client's, checking columns, noting discrepancies, doing what she had always done, but now with the standing to do it properly, formally, with her name on the letterhead and a pen in her hand that belonged to her. The door opened. Edmund Ashburn came in. He had a document, something minor, a question about a precedent. He asked it with the care of a man who is asking the real question underneath it, obliquely, and she answered it with the care of a woman who hears both questions and is choosing, for now, to answer only the one that was spoken. He thanked her. He started toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. He did not turn around. "Your father's letter," he said. "The one he wrote before he died. He said you already knew." A pause. He was right. He left. The door closed. The dust in the light continued its slow revolution. Nora sat for a moment. She thought about her father at his desk in Belwick, by a candle not unlike her own, writing in that careful hand. She thought about evidence and patience, and the particular kind of faith it takes to keep building a thing when you cannot yet see its shape. Then she picked up her pen and continued working. There is a version of this story where Nora waits to be rescued, where she trusts that justice will find her if she is patient enough, quiet enough, small enough not to cause trouble, where she stands on that cold street outside the ballroom and makes herself invisible one final time. That is not the story you just heard. What you heard was a woman who understood at the very end that the room was never going to turn on its own, that someone had to speak, that the someone was her. And I think you know why you stayed, because somewhere in some room you have stood exactly where she stood, surrounded by people who expected you to disappear, holding something true in your hands that no one wanted to hear. This channel exists for that version of you, for the woman who is still building her ledger, still counting the evidence, still not done. If these stories are yours, subscribe to Whispered Thrones. It is free. It costs you nothing but a moment, and I promise you, I will keep putting women like Nora in the middle of the room. Go well. And remember, she was standing in the most magnificent room in London, and every person in it wanted her to disappear. She didn't.